Hi, everyone. As a lot of you probably know, my name is Joe Skabinski, and I'm the president of JPS Labs, Abyss Headphones, and whatever other companies we managed to create along the way. Me and my sons run this company, and I've built this company up for over 30 years now. JPS Labs began in 1990 out of my basement, and within 5 or 6 years, we managed to move into space and started building a company. During that time, the last 30 years or so, our primary biz has been cables. The idea is to show people how I came about creating all these cables and why. And it's really about the company history and my history. And I ask you to be cool about this. We're not looking to pick on anyone, not looking to cause trouble. Let's be cool with the comments and understand that what I'm trying to tell you here is what my experience was with and what brought us to making cables. I know you guys are going to talk about this in the comments. I'm sure there'll be hundreds of them. And I'm just encouraging everybody to be decent to each other. There's no reason to call each other names. And, let's try to learn from it. So I should begin by saying that before I started this company, I became self-employed. I worked for a living, and I went to school in my younger years, obviously. I have a fairly technical background. It's electrical engineering, also heavy in electronics. My background was particularly with RF-based devices, professional communications gear. I was the guy they went to make things work in the field when it didn't work. So, I have pretty good knowledge on everything electronics, which of course now is 30 some years later. So that stuff's kind of like distant past, because what you find out with going to school is that when you're done with school, you still don't know shit. You're still learning. And a majority of it is out there in the real world, on the job and in the field. The bottom line is that what I want to discuss is how we came about to make cables. And when I first started JPS Labs, one of my prior jobs was actually at Bowers & Wilkins, B&W, they called themselves at the time. And they hired me to create a service center for the U.S. and Canada for their products. I've always had an interest in audio. Used to put together systems with multiple speakers back in the day when I lived at home in my bedroom, and I always appreciated audio. I used to be the DJ on the bus. I made my own boom box in high school, and I used to play the tunes on the bus going to school. So always loved audio. So it's not surprising that I wound up doing this for a living. So after being around all these neat toys for years, I really felt the need to make something that was mine, something unique. B&W, Teal, KEF, a lot of these speaker companies supplied a box. They called it a bass alignment filter, or it was an electronic device that went in line with the stereo gear, whether between the preamp and amp or somewhere in the line level. And these devices were designed to extend the bass response of a given loudspeaker by about 10 hertz. I think KEF had a thing they called the Cube. B&W's was a bass alignment filter. Teal had a box for their 3.5s and so on. What I decided to do is I'm going to make something that was better than what they had. While I was still working with B&W, I realized that there was a market for an aftermarket bass alignment filter to go with these loudspeakers. And I think one or two of their dealers at the time were making something like this too, because nobody really particularly cared for the factory units. So I said, well, I could work on this while I'm working with the company. Maybe we could add it to the product list. Well, in working on it, I found out that we couldn't, because they sold their products, obviously, with their brand name, and they weren't interested in aftermarket. So I decided I'll continue working on it and just make it my own at some point. And that in itself, just designing this rather simple device, turned out to be a challenge, because I wanted to make sure that this could be placed into an existing high-end system, 2-channel system. A lot of time, probably over a year, was spent with me creating ways to figure out how to tell the difference in sound between op amps. That was the first project I had was, all right, what op amp do you use? This was an op amp based device. It's just a simple amplifier with some capacitors in there and a power supply. And the question is, what op amp would sound better? I nothing I've ever had to do before. So I wound up creating an A-B device where you could sit back at your listening position and just randomly push a button. And the button would cause a box by the gear to toggle between two different sources, whatever that might be. So it was kind of a way to make my own double blind test, so to speak, where I had no idea what was playing. All I know is every time I pushed the button, it went from A or B, let's call it. So I started experimenting with different op amps and stuff like that. And I went through probably a dozen or so op amps in the same circuit. And long story short, I landed on an Analog Devices chip. And of course, this was done scientifically. I'm taking notes. I'm going, okay, what's the difference between whatever I assumed was A and B? And, and you start to learn. I was picking up, I think the first thing I was picking up on was transient differences, like differences in a single note or a cymbal hit or sub-sibilant that came out of a vocal. And you'd play that over and over again till you kind of learned it, till it became yours. And it was my early days of learning how to tell differences with, between things. It's a good way to start. I mean, if something catches you, you notice it in the music. It's something you could key in on to focus on and see if you can improve upon that. And I think transients were the biggest thing. Anyway, it was wild that I could write down and take notes on, narrow down the op amps that I preferred over ones I didn't, and they varied a lot. We're talking in a circuit that's a constant. So anyway, that was my early days of learning how to tell the difference between two things and listening to it. It turned out to be a maddening way to do it, though. I mean, that was the only way I knew how at the time, but we'll get into that later. So anyway, these Golden Flutes were line oval devices. They were designed to go, between gear. They needed an extra set of interconnect to be added to a system. And so, making and selling these, they were like $300 or $400 devices. They weren't crazy. And selling these for a year or two, I found out that one of the reasons people wouldn't purchase them was because they needed to buy a set of interconnect to go with it. And the interconnect that people were using at the time, believe it or not, the average price of a pair of cables was at that time around $500 or so a pair, which still isn't inexpensive by today's standards. But, looking at it now, you get cables for $10,000, $15,000. So the market's changed quite a bit in terms of what's available. But, at that time, we're talking Monster Cable and AudioQuest were some of the leaders, and they were about it. Maybe I could figure out a way to make a cable that would slip into these high-end systems, and people would accept it. It would be acceptable, sonically and otherwise. And so I started experimenting and playing with the various materials that were out there with cabling. Started with cables that existed. What does this stuff sound like? What does this stuff sound like? And I was curiosity. No idea. Never did this before. Never really bothered with it. As far as I was concerned, you put a cable in, it works, right? A lot of people are in the same boat. So here I am trying to surmise by listening and logic what's going on with a cable, and can I hear the differences? And initially, I went to my switching A/B box, and I'll switch between, two different cables coming from the same source, and I'll see if I could tell the difference. And initially, it was very, very difficult. Like, Jesus, I'm A-Bing this thing, and I'm like, I'm not getting it. I'm not seeing it. I'm not hearing it, should I say. At the time of doing this, I just remember it being like very tense. Like, it was almost frustrating because I'm like, well, I'm changing things. I agreed it's a cable, okay? It's not the electronics and so on, but I'm figuring if I could hear a difference between op amps and categorize each one of them, I should be able to hear any difference in the system if it's changed, all right? I'm just thinking along those lines of something. And I'm thinking maybe there's nothing here to hear, right? So ultimately I said, you know what, screw it. It just felt like there's so much pressure in hitting a button and A-Bing that I just said, the hell with it. This isn't working. This isn't the way to do it. And I started just leaving whatever I was using or trying to listen to as a cable in the system and see if I could get a feel for what changed over, the course of a few hours or a few days. To me, subjectively, what am I hearing here that's that I didn't feel like I heard before. And it is a feeling. All right. Music is about feeling. It's subjective. All right. But I'm being objective about what's going on that I'm hearing. I'm trying to discern change. There's no better way to do it than listen to it. So ultimately, I came to the conclusion that the quick A/B thing with the cable wasn't going to work. And after sitting down with changes that I made with the various cable topologies and types, I started to educate myself. What am I hearing? What differences am I hearing? And are they repeatable? Can I take this cable and put it back in and make the same notes that I did before? And what I come to find out is it was actually a learning process. I was educating myself as to what the differences were, even subtle as they might have been. I was educating myself as to what's going on here. And this went on for a long time. So, bottom line is I came out with a cable, our first cable. It's just like an RCA cable, hand soldered, got some nice connectors for it. I forget who the manufacturer was at the time. We're talking early 90s. And so I every time I talked to people about our Golden Flute device for their high-end system, I told them, well, we've got a cable for you if it's a problem. I think the first year we sold 2 cables. I mean, nobody would believe that these were any good. And I wasn't asking a lot. Whatever the cost was to make it or whatever, consumers in higher-end space, when they see something that inexpensive, they tend to ignore it. I spent a lot of years listening to these changes, and I started trying to quantify what was causing the change relative to the materials that were used in the cable design. Whether it be the conductor material, the dielectrics, the topology of the cable. Having an RF background, I was also considering how noise traveled through the cable. I think ultimately, speaking in noise, I think we were the first company to talk about RFI and EMI noise in a cable. I can't recall anyone before us doing it. And of course, all the big boys knocked us off because who are we? We don't even have a magazine ad running it, right? So it's something that, again, because I had an extensive background with these things, this invisible shower of noise that travels through interstages through the system, the PC boards, it's a problem. And so, I started to use that as one of the objective things to look at in the design of the cables. So I also learned at this point how to hear differences in materials where you can actually tell the sound of a particular material. I might surprise a lot of people, but it's true. You could take a silver conductor and listen to it. Let's say bare silver, no dielectric, nothing. 2 conductors. Make a cable out of it. Use it as an interconnect, left-right channel. Okay? Listen to it. Take copper. Do the same thing. Everything else is the same connectors, same solders. You put it together. Listen to it. And you start to see how there are changes in the materials, changes in sound due to the materials. Same with the dielectrics that are used on them. So over the course of years, I learned to get pretty good at this. And I learned what I liked and what I disliked about various materials and how they combine to make a cable. At some point, I wrote a spec to have a cable made. And I sourced vendors who were capable of making a conductor material that's the way I'd like it. And that basically led to where we are now, JPS Labs, making cables. And, again, there's an awful lot of personal research I put into this. I worked 16-hour days in the early years just to survive. And a big portion of it was learning and educating myself as to what all these changes were that were occurring from a scientific standpoint. Why is that? Now, I didn't get in and delve into, the molecular makeup of the dielectrics and so on. I just went with the type of various dielectrics like polypropylene, polyethylene. I got into this exotic Kapton like we have on this cord here. Very expensive dielectrics to deal with, and very few places in the world that are doing it nowadays. But the thing is that you start experimenting with this, and you find that you can create, the cable has a character of its own, and you can tune that. And it's a pretty cool thing once you learn how to do it, but you got to be dedicated, and it's a very long time to learn. Anyway, bottom line is that here we are today with the cables, and that's why I started. I appreciate everyone watching this portion. Next time we're going to talk more about cable design. Take care.